During this week, you need to start recording your YouTube presentation on your interview and upload that to YouTube so that we can watch them next week. This week's lecture is on poverty. Over the years, poverty rates have fluctuated, but they haven't declined. In fact, they have risen, particularly among minorities, children, and women head of households. When minimum wage increases, prices increase. People don't think about that very much. They think, oh, I'm getting a raise, I'm getting a quarter more an hour, and they don't realize that a loaf of bread just went up 50 cents. When the economy is better, people consume more and prices rise, which also leads to increases in poverty. Poverty provokes crime and doubts about the prevailing social order and government institutions. Some of the myths in poverty is that minorities are overrepresented, but actually they comprise only about a quarter of those in poverty, and nearly half of the poor are working, called the working poor, and many of those people also have children who watch their parents and perpetuate that cycle of poverty. There is a social stigma attached to poverty because work defines the person in this country. I mean, the first thing you do when you meet somebody is say, "Hi, what do you do?" And if there is no answer, you just sort of wander off and don't talk to them very much anymore. Work equals membership in society. It rivals family as a source of identity, belonging, and friendship. Virtually all benefits that we have, insurance, health insurance, longevity pay, are provided through our employment. Even in federal benefits, we separate the deserving and the undeserving, however. Medicare for the middle class and Medicaid for the poor. The stigma of a low-wage job is degradation of status. Inner city and poverty areas have lowered tax structures, thus they get fewer amenities. School systems are under that as well. Unfortunately, most of the schools that are subpar are in poverty areas because the tax structure doesn't support improvements. In this country, we admire the work ethic, independence, and self-sufficiency, but employment alone cannot solve the problem. Go back to the calculator in Module 1. Poverty undermines the concept of a just society and underlies many other social ills. Term called human capital. Human capital are the skills, the education, and credentials that individuals bring with them into the labor market. The majority of Americans believe that poverty is caused by individual deficits, laziness, low morals, and people on the dole, which actually is a local term that I've heard since I was a child, but it came out of Britain and derived from doling out or handing out money for food or cash, and dates back at least to 1919. Little empirical evidence exists that welfare or attitudes create or exacerbate poverty. Since the mid-1970s, the country has produced increasing percentages of low-paying, part-time, and without benefits jobs while sending manufacturing away. You need to work 89 hours a week to survive at minimum wage. Cross-sectional poverty, including more than one problem, is probably the worst type. If you take somebody who is uneducated minority with a child living in a economically depressed area, you have multiple problems. For example, African American children under 5 with a female-headed household had a poverty rate of 58.9% in 2007. Urban poverty, like urban homelessness, is more visible than it is in rural areas. U.S. poverty rates are the highest in the developed world. we're the only country with higher rates for children in poverty is Mexico. Although typically families are in poverty for only 1 or 2 years, one setback can cause them to go over the edge again, and more than half return within 5 years. In other words, in many cases, it is not whether we might encounter poverty, but when. Historically, relief is initiated or expanded during periods of civil disorder produced by mass unemployment, and then gets better when political and social stability is restored. Throw them a bone. The chief function of welfare is to regulate labor. When society stabilizes, the situation for those remaining on the welfare rolls, like the elderly, the disabled, the mentally incapacitated, are so dreary that it dissuades able-bodied workers from backsliding. There's 2 different types of relief. One is expansive, which is there to mute civil disorder, and the second is restrictive, which reinforces the work norms after that order has been restored. Social welfare policies are normally to restore order but have little to do with aiding the poor. Most help the government or big business. Social Security and unemployment are 2 exceptions, of course. Both of those programs are contingent upon the person having contributed to the system over time, and they are entitlements. If we review the rise and fall of welfare through a historical lens, we find this to be true. Note the sociological, political upheaval shortly before the programs are instituted or upgraded. There was no real measure of poverty lines until the 1960s, when poverty was associated with insufficient income rather than with persons on government subsidy. To reiterate Adam Smith's assertion of almost 200 years earlier, economist John Kenneth Galbraith observed that people are poverty-stricken if their income is below that of the community. In 1962, the Harrington book got the attention of JFK, who began some poverty programs, and in 1964, LBJ began the War on Poverty. Interestingly, there were a lot of photographs and film clips at the time, and they all showed images of poor Appalachian white people who had fallen on hard times, whereas the modern image of poverty is usually African American, lazy, refusing to work. Some terms associated with poverty. Absolute poverty is a threshold under which there is deprivation. In other words, there's not enough money for subsistence. Relative poverty is keeping up with the Joneses. If you don't know that expression, it means, being of the same economic level as perhaps your next door neighbor or your peer group. If you're in relative poverty, you can't adequately participate in social organizations and relationships. You may see a car as a necessity, not a luxury, and it's a level of comfort. Elasticity of poverty. Poverty lines tend to rise in relation to income increases in the general population. As I said, when the economy is good, poverty exists. When minimum wage goes up, prices get higher, poverty exists. Geography plays a major role in poverty distribution. Most poverty is among minority groups in cities or on reservations, with the exception of rural areas, Caucasian Appalachia. However, not everyone that lives in the ghetto is a criminal, lazy, or unemployed. Upper mobility among the working poor devastates already devastated neighborhoods. It goes back to the discussion of gentrification a week or so ago, that once upper scale families start to move into a community, businesses tend to follow, and the poor cannot support businesses because they can't afford it. Patterns of poverty are more pervasive among single females with children and minorities. And some people are likely to report hardships as having not enough money to pay the food or the rent, but they have TVs, refrigerators, and today almost everybody has a cell phone. Once again, you know, what is poor in your community? Many people move in and out of poverty. Some stay there. Poverty rates vary across states, as does aids to those in poverty. Although the United States has the highest GNP, gross national product, per capita, it has higher levels of absolute and relative poverty than just about all of Europe. This slide's a little blurry, but hopefully you can figure out what's going on. There was a poll taken in 2001, and 48% of the people interviewed thought people were not doing enough to pull themselves out of poverty, whereas 45% thought it was a set of circumstances that reduced them to that level. 2/3 believed the poor had the same values as most Americans, and 1/5 thought they had low morals. In 1970, 42% of families had a working father, a homemaker mother, and children. Today, only 16% fit this model. Half of all children live with only one parent. Welfare deals with disorder, not by simply giving aid, but by requiring the poor to behave in certain ways to receive it. Rapid changes in the marketplace often leave labor maladapted, like farming to machinery to industrialization, technology, and now, of course, to the service industry. Early relief payments were purposely kept below the market level. If you have enough money, then you stop trying. So if you keep it below the level, then people will keep trying to become employed and take care of themselves. The workhouses, as I said earlier, the conditions were purposely hard to ensure that no one with alternatives would want to be there, that they would offer themselves to any employer on any terms. And the mass revolt or the vote at the voting booth didn't help the disenfranchised. And in the early days of our country, of course, women and minorities, in many cases African Americans, were not permitted to vote. In Tennessee, 13.4% of our population are in poverty, whereas the median income in the state is $36,000 to $42,000 a year. 8.1 to 9% of our children live in poverty. Once again, ironically, obesity persists among the children at 34 to 44%, and among adults at 65 to 68%. We do have a tax on food. They buy what they can afford. They buy canned vegetables, which are high in sugar and salt, bologna, which is kind of what's left over on the cutting room floor after they make the good meat, macaroni and cheese, Kool-Aid, and, you know, of course you have to add in the gas to get to the grocery store to purchase these things. I just put this in because I found it ironic that the lottery in Tennessee is supported primarily by the poor and by African Americans, whereas Hope scholarships tend to go to the middle class. Just a term I would like for you to be aware of, it's devolution, and that is the statutory granting of powers from the central government of a sovereign state to a government at a subnational level. This includes the block grants that we talked about earlier, where the federal government gives a large chunk of money to the state to hand out among its citizens. But what most people don't know is that the block grants usually require matching funds. So if the state gets $100,000 from the federal government, then the state must be willing to put up or able to put up $100,000. People consider sales tax fair because everyone shops and everyone pays, whereas property tax is often considered unfair because it only hits the affluent. income tax through the earned income credit that we talked about earlier. The poor can often receive more than they paid into the system. Some people think the only fair way to tax is a flat tax, wherein everybody pays 10% of their annual income regardless of what it is. TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, has not increased the amount since 1997. There are different requirements for different states. For example, in Alabama, a single parent with 2 children making $3,200 a month is not eligible. While in that should be $3,200. While in California, the same family making $11,700 is eligible. In Mississippi, families receive $170 a month, while in California, they receive $704 a month. And it's true that the cost of living is 47% higher in California, but TANF is 414% higher. In Tennessee, almost 180,000 currently receive benefits of $576 each a month, whereas in North Carolina, right next door, there are 59,000 receiving $1,605 each. The average in 1983, the average family saved 10.8% of their salary, but in 2003, that had dropped to 1.4%, and likely it's less now. Some causes of poverty we've already talked about. To reiterate, in some cases in 2005, 30% of the workforce was part-time, temporary, contract, or day laborers. Each one of these positions is contingent upon the need of the employer. If the employer doesn't need you, you simply don't have a job. In education, the student debt currently is $140 billion. And education is becoming a privilege because college tuitions are rising and Pell Grants are being cut and loans are harder to get. The poor, of course, can't afford it at all and must go to work. There's been a certain amount of retail polarization in this country. The small middle-class stores and mom-and-pop stores are basically gone. It's really hard to open a small specialty shop in a city and have it be successful because you can't compete with places like Walmart and Kmart and Target. If you're ever interested, this is kind of fascinating research. Go trace who owns what in this country, and you will find, I think, that very few corporations own almost everything, and particularly the media is owned by only a very few corporations, and they tend to, of course, mold public opinion, and the corporations send lobbyists to Washington to affect legislation. On the other hand, the average senator spends $7.3 million during a campaign, and in the 2004 presidential election, George Bush and John Kerry spent a combined $548 million just for the campaign. People with money tend to vote more often than people without money. And this I just put in because it interested me. The Walton family, the heirs to Walmart, including the widow and 4 children, have a net worth of over $90 billion. They do give some of that money to charity, and the charities are charities that they have set up themselves for education, and those charities advocate privatization and the voucher system. Voucher system, of course, allows you to send your child to whatever school you would like. Between 1994 and 1997, only 19,000 jobs were created in manufacturing, with 400,000 in retail. The information age and service jobs have deepened the problem for unskilled labor. A shift to the service economy has essentially done away with blue-collar jobs, and then if you add in outsourcing and the closure of small plants, it exacerbates the problem. Minorities and the uneducated were hit directly by outsourcing and by NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Ross Perot, who sometimes is very amusing, called NAFTA a great sucking sound. In other words, sucking the money out of our country and into neighboring countries. Add in downsizing, outsourcing, part-time and contingent work, and you have a great deficit in jobs. The working poor essentially are ignored as a social problem. The largest group of poor are not on welfare. They work and make too much money for welfare, but not enough to live. But they're not counted as poor or unemployed because they're working. In 2001, 1/4 of children under 6 lived in poverty. The poor comprised of youth, single parents, uneducated minorities, and when they intersect, once again, it's a much worse condition. The rich, someone said once, are very different from you and me. The rich, of course, send their children to private schools. They have country clubs, so they don't use public parks. They have their own vehicle, so they don't use public transportation. They live in gated communities that have private security guards, so they don't really require the police. They often pay for private trash pickups, so they don't use sanitation workers. And they often have private retirement, so they don't even take their Social Security money. Thus, they resent paying for services they don't use, and you really can't blame them for that. But we lose a great deal of support that way. Once again, income and wealth are not the same thing. Real income equals purchasing power. How much purchasing power do you have for your dollar? And executives in corporations that downsize or outsource often get large bonuses for that because they save the company a great deal of money by sending it to India where things are cheaper. To be comfortable, a family should have 6 months' salary in reserve. I know very few people that could say they are comfortable. The working poor hold the lowest paying, least stable jobs. 37% are in the service sector, restaurants, small markets, those kinds of things, sometimes seasonal employment. 30% are in retail. And in these positions, they're less likely, of course, to receive benefits or any job training that would aid their upward mobility. They may have seasonal employment. They may be farm workers that go from place to place. They may work in resort areas. They may lack higher education. They may not. They may have health issues and less access to health care. They may not participate in, or they may be ineligible for assistance. Who are they? The working poor is comprised by 56% women, 15% non-citizens, and the rest of it is made up by African Americans, Hispanics, the elderly, people with disabilities. And once again, the unemployment figures rise and fall, but do not consider the working poor among their count. The chicken and egg syndrome, again, in times of economic distress, it is supportive to shop at local merchants. I just found this a couple of days ago. I found it of interest. In fact, shifting only 10% of your purchases to locally owned businesses adds $24 million a year to the local economy. For every $100 you spend on a national chain, Walmart, the economic impact is only $13. Yet at the same amount spent with a local merchant yields $45. It sounds good, but the poor cannot afford to spend $5 for a loaf of bread at a specialty shop when it's available at Walmart for $1. When people are overworked and underpaid, the community breaks down. Service agencies become fragmented. Community social groups and churches lose members, and they have a tendency to possibly rise up. One of the largest social movements in history was the populism movement. It was made up of urban wage earners and farm workers who were concerned with overconcentration of wealth, classism. Many sought grassroots education through lectures and pamphlets. A little known fact of Tennessee history, unless you've been in a class with me before, is that there's a place called Highlander Folk Center in Tennessee. And Highlander has been around since the 1930s. It's still in existence. It has worked with the Appalachian Poor. It was very instrumental in the civil rights movement. It's worked with union organizing. And currently working with migrants and with gay, lesbian, and transgendered issues, and still all the way through with the Appalachian Poor. Highlander brings people into a meeting, and they all sit in a circle and they talk about what's going on in their community, and through listening to other stories they get ideas to go back to their own community to make things better, to facilitate change. The populism movement led to the People's Party, which you might be able to compare to our current Tea Party. The political movement broke up as both Republicans and Democrats courted voters with the same issues as politicians have a tendency to do. But social grassroots movement pushed FDR to institute the New Deal, and other areas in history have improved because of grassroots.